Final Fantasy XI was tough. Really tough. The game that we have access to in 2022 is accommodating, but is the result of 20 years worth of quality and life improvements, likely designed in a way to accommodate the dwindling population since its heyday. The early years of 11 were brutal. Every death would chip away at your hard-earned XP, sometimes leaving you half naked because you de-leveled and now you can't equip some of your gear. However, this difficulty is what brought together the community and is one of the main reasons I have such fond memories of the game. Suffering in silence is one thing, but suffering together is how strong friendships and bonds are created. Before I continue, I'd love to know if anyone played on Hades back in the day, before it merged into Cerberus. That server has a special place in my heart, as I have met some amazing people there and had a gaming experience that I've never been able to replicate to this day. Final Fantasy XI has always been an exceptional MMO. Despite its difficult learning curve, it was reasonably well balanced, had considerable depth, and was a feat and joy to master. Veteran players proudly AFK'd in cities like Jeuno and Whitegate, while newer players examined them in awe, wondering when the day would come when they could replicate the same aesthetic and strength. It's incredible the difference of 20 years can make in a game, especially when utilizing a PlayStation 2 era engine. The 11 I occasionally come back to every couple of years is considerably more generous than the one I spent days updating with less than 1 megabyte broadband connection half a lifetime ago. I was lucky I got broadband very early. I appreciate some were on 56k still. The addition of trusts, mounts, and XP pages suddenly made the game feel far less dangerous than I remember. Running to the dunes, or even Juno for the first time, was exhilaratingly dangerous. If you were unlucky enough to pull aggro from a mob or mobs, it was very likely you would die a swift death. You'd be then sent back from whenever your home point was saved to, most likely your main city. Potentially 40 to 60 minutes of travelling time completely wasted, as well as an XP loss. That didn't deter people though, it actually made these journeys fun, almost like a rite of passage to do so. The world felt alive and it felt dangerous. Final Fantasy XI, like similar games of that time, threw you headfirst into unexplained systems, menus, and mechanics. I remember vividly the first time I ever logged in, after reading through the text-based opening cutscenes and thinking, what the hell do I do now? While there were strong elements of previous Final Fantasy games present, nothing was too familiar. It was a whole new world, eagerly waiting to be explored. What's crazy to think is that at the time of release, just actually running the game was demanding. If you opted for the PlayStation 2 route, you'd need a specific hard drive and network adapter, which as you can imagine wasn't cheap. For PC, the graphics card required was likely much better than the one you were using for Counter-Strike or EverQuest. I remember my friends from Phantasy Star Online complaining that they'd finally received their copy of Final Fantasy XI, yet were struggling to run it. The learning curve didn't end there either. Navigating the Play Online launcher and registering your account and CD keys without losing your mind to the repetitive and catchy music was also a daring accomplishment by itself. Once I quickly realized that there were no obvious linear paths to take when playing this game, I decided to adventure out in the world. Choosing Bastok as my starting city, I ventured into South Gusterberg and attacked everything that I could, often being forced back to my mog house in Bastok markets after being stung by one too many bees. I kept thinking to myself, surely this game can't be that hard, right? Weird little worms, small goblins, and oddly shaped pink birds kept murdering me throughout the morning. This was nothing like the game I had just come from, PSO, but 11's slow pace kept me intrigued. Still, there was a lot of satisfaction seeing continuous whiffs of my sword, with the occasional 0.1 skill up notifications appearing in the chat box. If you grew up playing Final Fantasy games, like I think a lot of 11 players did, your muscle memory for attacks, magic, and items was essentially useless. 11's menus had menus within a menu. Over time, these menus were a blessing, as it allowed quite a large amount of customization to what information you wanted to see, as well as allowing you to assign specific pieces of gear to abilities and spells via macros. It legitimately felt like you'd passed a degree in programming once you're able to create complex macros on the fly. Having said all that, fully understanding the UI was just the first hurdle. There are 3 words that if uttered to 11 players, they either cheer with joy or weep in sorrow. Chains of Promathia. The original 11 was hard, but the second expansion was really challenging. It required a lot of time, physical energy, gear sets, and people who were on the same mission as you were. It wasn't uncommon to find static groups who agreed to complete the whole expansion together with the same people. Looking back at it now, I'm not sure whether Chains of Promathia was how an expansion should be, or whether it really was just unnecessarily too long and difficult. especially when in comparison with Rise of Zilla or Treasures of Artagan. 11 existed at a time when data mining wasn't really a thing, and wikis fan sites were not as user-friendly as they are now. Some of the best sites were fan-made, and there were so many crazy theories revolving around treasure hunter and crafting that were taken as gospel for years. A lot of the theories and strategies for everything in the game were just passed on by random people, with a severe case of trust me bro. It almost felt like the age of primitive man, making up stories to explain why the sun comes up or why it has started raining. I was lucky enough to have been picked up by a friendly link shell early on in my 11 journey, which allowed me access to countless people who would teach me the ropes of the game, or help with specific quests or notorious monsters that would have otherwise stopped me from moving forward. I of course replicated this kindness and ran many people through numerous quests, missions and NM kills throughout my time. This was especially important because a lot of fights involved prerequisite materials or preparation that could be wiped out in an instant if you weren't fully prepared, wasting hours of time. This is what I loved though. The challenge, the accomplishment, the community. Obtaining gear or even just seeing it drop from a monster was exhilarating. I'll never forget my first H&M claim, which took hours and hours of frantically spamming a provoke macro during a specific time window. For those that don't know, H&Ms were essentially world bosses that had absurdly long respawn times and even worse respawn windows. Some of the best gear at the time were obtained from these monsters, and the top players on the server would compete to try and gain hate or aggro on it before the other groups. There are few games that can rival the longevity of 11, especially when considering the game hasn't followed the free-to-play bandwagon so many of its competitors were forced to do so. It's too late to make the shift though, I feel, and what amazes me is that there are still enough hardcore fans to make it worthwhile for Square Enix to keep the lights on. When the console versions of 11 were shut down in 2016, it seemed like the beginning of the end. Many people quit to move on to better things, but a lot did stay, despite the rampant doom and gloom of the community assuming the worst. In reality, what actually happened is that the devs ramped up their work on the game and produced some fairly decent content, even all these years later. Similar to Final Fantasy XIV, one of 11's biggest selling points has always been its storyline. Personally, I was an avid cutscene skip spammer. It hurts me to say it, but when getting to said cutscenes took so long, I just felt like I didn't have the time to enjoy them, especially if there was a party of friends or acquaintances waiting for me. I think if I could go back in time, I'd enjoy every aspect of the story to its fullest. It's quite funny to think about how 11's story is probably the longest and most intricate in the whole of the Final Fantasy series, yet only a small portion of fans will ever truly have sampled it. Speaking of which, there is nothing I would love more than a port or remaster of 11, whether it was a single player or just updated to the current age. Unfortunately, there were rumours of a mobile version of 11, but I believe it has been cancelled. I often reminisce of the 75 cap and below era, and it feels like a previous life. When the reminiscing becomes too much, I re-download the game and log on to my multi-99 job capped character, looking around at everyone with their fully upgraded Remo weapons and other top tier gear, and just always come to the conclusion that it isn't the same anymore. But that's okay. The game had to evolve to stay alive, and I'd rather an 11 that exists in some capacity than it to be deleted forever. Perhaps if I joined a link shell full of talkative and friendly people, that would reignite my love for the current game. But as a father of 3 little Moogles, I'm not sure I have the time anymore. If you stay to the end, I tip my chocobo feathered fedora to you. I'd also love to hear about your fondest 11 memories, regardless of if it was camping Leaping Lizzie in the early 2000s, or soloing Absolute Virtue as a fully decked out level 99. Thanks again, till next time.